Hello, Year 10 sociologists. I'm going to launch over the next week or so a series of revision lessons on the different perspectives in education. So that's functionalism, Marxism, feminism, and the new right. And we're going to kick off with functionalism first. Now, I appreciate that we've done some exercises on this recently, but I wanted to explain and talk through each of the perspectives so everybody understands them, and then this can form the basis of a good revision resource that you can refer to in the future. There's a couple of ways that you might use this. One, you might sit and stop and take notes and then start again. Another way to do it would be to watch it straight through so that you kind of get the full picture and then go back and add to the notes that you've already got. Don't feel that you have to write notes on everything here because you will have some already. So if you spread them out in front of you, you can consult those notes when you're watching this. Okay, so we're going to start off, like I said, with functionalism education, and we got four key thinkers. That's Durkheim, Parsons, and the pair of sociologists, Davis and Moore. And we're going to kick off with Emil Durkheim. Okay, so Durkheim is if you like, the founding father of functionalism. He's the first person to write from that perspective. Okay, and what he says is that schools are like society in miniature. So when we're born into our families, if you like, that's our first exposure to the culture that we live in. That's called primary socialization. We know that already. And then our kind of first introduction into the world outside our families is within school generally, although you could argue that the media plays an important role these days. But in actually being in the same place as other individuals and physically interacting with them, nursery, primary school, and then secondary school is how we do that most. And like I said, Durkheim argued that schools were society in miniature, and they prepare us for moving on into wider society. So you might behave in a particular way with your families, people that you're very familiar with, but once you get into kind of classrooms and social situations and corridors and assemblies and so on within schools, you're going to behave in a different way than you might at home. And that's because you are being introduced to a wider social network, and that affects how we behave. So that's why Durkheim referred to it as society in miniature. Okay, and as we interact with the people around us in schools, with teachers and fellow students and so on, we start to learn the rules of how we should behave within our society. So if somebody's talking to us, we might listen to them rather than start talking over them. And that's what we call norms and values, and we know that already. Okay, so Durkheim identifies two key functions of education, and we've already been introduced to these through our notes and through earlier lessons. So the first is this notion of creating social solidarity. Now, if you think of something that's solid, we think about something that is kind of dependable, that we can lean on. It might change over time, but it doesn't change very radically over a short space of time. And what Durkheim is saying is that education creates a society that is stable. Okay, so if you think about solidarity in terms of something that is stable and doesn't change radically. Okay, and he saw that education transmits the norms and values of wider society to individuals. So within families, families different in terms of what's important to them and what the outside world, what would be important to them in the outside world and so on. So what Durkheim sees as education is doing, is to compensate for families who have different versions of what the world is like. So education is starting to get people to sing from the same hymn sheet. Okay, so in order for society to function, all members should have this shared set of values, what's important to us. So a value might be, for example, respecting private property. It might be ambition. It might be education itself. So we value education in Western societies. We think it's a good and an important thing. And anybody who doesn't is kind of seen as going against society's value system. So he claims that the teaching of shared values comes both in terms of subjects. So if we think of history in particular, in history we learn about the kings and queens of Britain. We learn about kind of historically battles. World War I, World War II are very important in relation to British identity. So within subjects we learn about our society, but also within the hidden curriculum we learn how to fit into our society. So if you think about the behaviour system within Delisle, the positive and negative behaviour points that are attributed to behaving well and doing well, or the opposite. And that's the hidden curriculum. That's all the things that go on within school that aren't timetabled, that help us to fit in, to follow the rules. Okay. The second one is teaching skills for work. And what Durkheim is saying is that in modern industrial societies, we've got quite complex production, really. So if we go back to pre-industrial times, most people were employed in agriculture. So they're growing produce to either feed themselves, or if they have a surplus, they're going to try and barter or sell that produce in order to either get money or to exchange it for other goods. And actually, a lot of people would have been able to do both, would have been able to grow things and then swap that for other stuff that they couldn't do. So, for example, somebody else might make clothes. You would exchange your produce from the land to get some clothes. Okay, and many people did both. They might have, within families, they might have worked on the land, and somebody else would have made clothes. Very few shops, and there's not much because there isn't very much to buy. So people are really subsistence living. They're just living on what they actually need. But as you get to the industrial age and commerce, so we can go out and buy things, we need a much more divided labour force where people specialise. They do different things. So if somebody asks you now what you want to do when you leave school, people will give a variety of different answers. We're not all going to say that we're going to work on the land and grow our own produce. We're going to have different ideas. Some of us might be lawyers, doctors, motor mechanics, whatever. And that's what we call specialisation. So what Durkheim is saying is that schools help us to specialise. So he says that some jobs are more important than others. So to be a doctor or a lawyer is seen within society as to be more important than cleaners and hairdressers. And that's because if you're a doctor, you're very, very specialist. And there's a lot of sacrifices you have to make to become that specialist. So school starts off, if you think about primary school, everybody's taught the same subjects. But as you go through schooling, you start to specialise more. So when you got to year 9, you had an increased choice about what it is you might have done for your GCSEs or BTECs. And then when you get to post-16, you're going to have much more choice. There are some criticisms of Durkheim, and you'd expect that within sociology because not everybody thinks that society is run in the same way and is run for the same people's interests. So a major criticism says that actually within society there isn't one particular shared culture. So if we think about Britain, for example, today is the start of Ramadan. So we've got, about 2.5 million Muslims who live in Britain, and they have aspects of their culture are different to that of mainstream culture. So one criticism of Durkheim is not everybody shares the same norms and values. Okay, another one is that the education system doesn't actually, many people would argue, teach the skills that are needed for this modern, for highly specialised workforce. Many employers say that students come out of the education system not having the skills that they need in their workplaces for young people to be very productive, and they have to put a lot of effort into training them. Marxists would say that actually it is right that a particular culture is being transmitted, but it isn't a shared culture. It's one that's imposed on people, and it's imposed to benefit the ruling class, not society as a whole. So if a large group of society don't do well within education, then that's their fault, and we're led to believe that. The Marxists would say, well, no, it's not. It's like that's creating a false class consciousness where people blame themselves for their lack of achievement in education, rather than the way education is organised to benefit middle class people. Feminists would say that actually education works very successfully to create a patriarchal society, that some subjects are seen as male and some subjects are seen as female, and spaces within classrooms and corridors and so on are male dominated in terms of behaviour. So the feminists would say that Durkheim is ignoring the fact that schools are patriarchal. And finally, not all students come to accept the values of society. So if we have social solidarity, and that is a key function of education, according to Durkheim, then how come not everybody behaves in the same way? What's going on there? Okay, so the next functionalist we're going to learn about is Talcott Parsons. Now, he's an American, and he picks up the ideas of Durkheim and runs with them, if you like. And what he does is he differentiates between two value systems, universalistic values and particularistic ones. That's going to come up in the slide in a second. So universalistic values are the values that everybody has, and they apply to everyone. So in your family, if you like, as you were growing up, and we've talked about this before, where mums and dads might have said to you, oh, you did your best, that's great. Well, what Parsons is getting at is that, yeah, that's fine within a family, but within wider society, that's not so good. That actually we need to measure people and their success within education using universalistic values. So, for example, you're going to hear, as you go through into year 11, you're going to hear that kind of magic idea of getting 5 level grade 4s or 5 grade 5s, and these are kind of key measurements of how you've done in your education, and that's a threshold that allows you to do any of the courses, A levels or BTECs, advanced, and so on. So that's if you like, that's society using universalistic values to measure how successful you've been in education. So the argument Parsons is using here is it doesn't really matter what your parents think about how well you've done or not, it's how society thinks you've done. Parents treat and judge their children according to particularistic standards of their family. In other words, children are judged as good or bad depending on the values of the particular family. But the education system, it shares these universalistic values that everyone is measured by. Okay. Parsons is arguing that a person's status in society is increasingly achieved. So when you're first born, your status is ascribed. So you, as a year 10 student, you get the social class that your parents or parent belong to. But actually, as you leave school and start work, you're going to achieve your own status. That's why it's known as achieved status. The education system prepares people for this transition. So it smooths, if you like, over the transition between you moving from family to the wider world of work. So education, if you like, is that stepping stone. And it treats everybody the same, according to Parsons, with these universalistic values. So Parsons identifies 3 key functions of education. And again, these aren't new to us. So the first one is value consensus, and you can see the overlap here with Durkheim's work on this idea of social solidarity. So students are encouraged to value high achievement and to believe that they're competing with each other in equal terms. So if you're working within a subject and you see sort of your fellow students as rivals and trying to get the top grade, or you're going to try and beat your mate in a particular assessment, that's really what Parsons is getting at here, that we're competing with each other. So we compete with education, and then we're going to end up competing in wider life as well when we get into the workplace. So high achievers are seen as deserving of their success because in that competition they've done well. Lower achievers accept their lower status as fair because they haven't done so well. Okay, Parsons identified society as meritocratic. Okay, so society is a meritocracy. So that merit for Parsons and for other functionalists is this idea of ability and effort. So how able are you and how hard do you work? And we live in a society, according to Parsons and other functionalists, that insists that actually the education system recognises how able you are and how hard you work, and then it'll assign you a position in life through the grades that you get in GCSEs or A levels or BTECs or a degree, and then that'll allow you to achieve a particular position in life, so to do a job that has status. Okay? So we saw the education system as being meritocratic, so it's fair, and those who work hard and are able are the ones who rise to the top, and it's based on your ability and effort. It's got nothing to do with your social class, your gender, or your ethnicity. It's based on your talent. Then finally, what Parsons argues is that because we've got a meritocratic society, that the education system can role allocate. It can give people the appropriate role based on the merit that they have achieved within education. So school matches people to their correct jobs based on their ability. And this, as we said, is role allocation. So based on your qualifications, the most able should reach the top jobs in a meritocratic society. That should say the slide. Again, we've got some criticisms of Parsons. So the first criticism is that the Marxists believe that, again, these values that are transmitted, they don't benefit society as a whole, they benefit the ruling classes. So a key phrase here would be that these values are imposed, they are not shared. And that's a key criticism of both Parsons and Emile Durkheim. The feminists again argue that the education system isn't meritocratic. Gender can have an influence on the achievement and of subject choice. So if you look around, well, you won't be able to at the minute, but if you look around when we're back at school in certain subjects, you will see, particularly the option subjects, you'll see a predominance of either one gender or the other. Also, people criticise Parsons' idea of role allocation. And they criticise it because they say some of the highest earners in society have left school with no qualifications. So if we think about one of the most famous examples is Alan Sugar. He left school at 15, he didn't do any qualifications, and yet he's a multi-billionaire. And that would argue that actually schools don't allocate roles in the way that Parsons insists. Okay, so the final pair of sociologists that we need to know about are Davis and Moore. And Davis and Moore, we can see, they come on a little bit later and pass away a little bit later than Talcott Parsons. And they do a lot of work using this idea of meritocracy and role allocation. So if you like, they pick up Parsons' work and run with it. Okay, so they say that every society sorts its members into different positions. Okay, so that's this idea of specialization that we talked about earlier. They think that there are rules for how education does this called the principles of stratification. Now, stratification is a very posh sounding word, which just means the layering of society. So strata refers to layers. I'm pretty sure we've talked about this before. Strata is the Latin word for layers. Stratification means the layering of society. And Davis and Moore say, yes, society is layered, so it's not that everybody ends up getting the same amount of money for doing their jobs and so on. And they say that that's a good thing. It's a good thing that you have people who win in terms of education and the workplace and people who don't win or who lose, for want of a better phrase. They think that's a good thing and it's functional for society. So they believe that there has to be a system of unequal rewards. So we need to have unequal rewards. If you think about in terms of pay or income, money and status, then how do people regard you in society? Do they look sideways at you? Do they look up on you? Or do they look down on you in terms of your status? And that those are really important to motivate people when you're earlier on, when you're in education doing your GCSEs. The argument is, according to Davis and Moore, that the most motivated people are those who want to do best in education. So they're going to work really hard and they should be rewarded for that. Why shouldn't they? So they go on to say that education sorts people according to their talents and abilities. Okay, so the education system acts to sift and sort people into their appropriate roles within society. And we use certificates to do that. So GCSE certificates, A-level certificates, and so on. So according to Davis and Moore, those who do best at school will do best in wider society because they've got the qualifications to prove that. And therefore they will find it easier to get their foot in the door into the door of the better paid jobs. Okay, so if we take this view of social stratification, so all that means is the layering of society. So what Davis and Moore are saying is that without the stratification system, society would disintegrate. It just wouldn't work. We need different layers. We need inequality within society because it's functional. So it has the function of role allocation. It makes sure that the most able and the most talented do the most important jobs, as we've already said, and again, building on the work of Parsons. Inequality and reward and status are essential to motivate the best individuals to take on their roles and jobs. These roles require long periods of training. So if you want to become an architect, you're going to have to do about 7 years of qualification after you leave school. So you will do 3 or 4 years at university, and then you will have to further qualify whilst working for an architectural firm until you become a member of the Royal Institute of British Architects. So you're going to make a lot of sacrifices to get to become an architect, which is a very well paid, very well thought of job. So those sacrifices, Davis and Moore are saying, need to be rewarded, otherwise people just wouldn't do it. So you're not going to make you're not going to miss out on 3 years earning because you want to go to university, and also not earning very much money when you first leave university to train as an architect. You're not going to do that unless you know at the end of that you're going to be rewarded handsomely. Okay, so those high rewards, according to Davis and Moore, they compensate, they pay back people for spending a long time in education and training. And this argument is often used to justify high rewards given to company directors and for famous sports stars or entertainment stars. The idea is that they can do things that other people can't, therefore they should be rewarded for them. Okay, and then we've got some criticisms of the work of Davis and Moore. Okay, and they're going to sound similar to the criticisms of Parsons and Durkheim because they're all functionalists, and their theories have got an awful lot of overlap. So the first criticism is that there's evidence of differential achievement in terms of class, gender and ethnicity, and this suggests therefore that society isn't meritocratic. So year on year, if we look at certain ethnic groups, we'll see that they don't do as well as other ethnic groups. So for example, we know that year on year, white working class boys within the United Kingdom are one of the least well performing in terms of educational outcomes. And that happens year on year. There's a pattern there. Okay? So what's going on? If society is meritocratic, why do we see these very definitive or very definite patterns year on year? Why do girls do better than boys? And why do middle class kids always do better than working class kids? Why is that the case? If society is completely meritocratic and people are rewarded on the basis of their ability and effort, are we saying that all working class kids don't work hard? Okay. Another criticism is that there's a very close relationship between academic achievement and earning. So there isn't a close relationship between how well you do at school and how much you earn. So there are lots of jobs where people who've done very well at school to be able to access, so if we think about nursing, teaching, physiotherapy and so on, where people have been relatively successful within education, and that's not necessarily rewarded. So if we go back to the idea of sports people, many sports people achieve very, very high rewards, but actually didn't do that well at school. So the relationship that Davis and Moore talk about in relation to succeeding in education and therefore succeeding in the world of work isn't as straightforward as they maintain. And there's doubt about whether the education system in itself actually is very good at measuring people's ability or their intelligence. So there's very few people who would claim that Alan Sugar is not a very, very clever person or a very intelligent person, but actually he didn't do well within the education system. So what's going on there? Do we think that our education system is a very good way of measuring people's intelligence, because there are many different aspects of intelligence? Okay, and finally, functionalism doesn't consider that the education might transmit ruling class values. So Davis and Moore, they don't get into this at all. They're saying that the value system, the norms and values that are shared within the education system, well, actually, they would insist that they're very useful and very functional for everyone. But many people would argue, particularly the Marxists and feminists, would say the feminists would say that these value systems and these norms suit men, whereas the Marxists would say it suits those people who are in the ruling class, if you like, the people who own the means of production. And it also doesn't go on to explain, well, if everybody through the education system shares these norms and values, why is there conflict within society? Why do people identify education and other aspects of agencies of socialization as actually working against everybody and favouring the few? Okay. So that's the end of this lesson on functionalism. Like I say, maybe you should have watched it through and then go back and look at your notes now, and is there anything that you would need or you think you need to add to them. So what I'll do is I'll put up one in the next few days, well, probably early next week, on Marxism and education, and then we'll go on to look at feminism and the new right. I might cover those in one session because there's not as much to do there. And then I'll do something on cultural deprivation, material deprivation, before we start to look inside school at why some kids don't do as well as others in school. Okay, like I say, hope you're well, and I hope you found this useful.